Many of you will be familiar with Lori. Lori offered webinars with the stewardship staff a couple of years ago. Many of them are still posted online on our stewardship on the presbyterian.ca website. So much of the material that's in her book, or some of the material that's in her book, was introduced in our webinars, and it even expands and develops it even more. This webinar is brought to you by the Presbyterian Church in Canada with generous gifts to Presbyterian Sharing, and we're very grateful for all the congregations and individuals who support the Presbyterian Church in Canada's mission and ministry by giving to Presbyterian Sharing. So Lori, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Karen. I'm really glad to be here. So in the next 45 minutes or so, maybe probably a little less, what we're going to do is look at the book. I mean, it's there, it's here, and talk about how your church can use this book, because that's the whole point of writing the book, is a book that a church can use to talk about giving. And lots of room for questions. If you have questions, please type them into the chat and we'll address them as we go, and we'll take time at the end as well if we need to. But there's no silly questions, there's no dumb questions. I often have a slide, I don't have it today, but I say I've got young adult kids. I haven't had an uninterrupted thought in decades, so just let you know, today won't be the first time, so it's fine. This is what you're seeing now is the back pages of the book. It's kind of the blurb, because Growing a Generous Church is indeed a year in the life of Peach Blossom Church. It's a fictional church, but it's real to me. It's made up of a composite of so many churches I've been to, Presbyterian and otherwise. It's a hopeful story for churches who are scared to talk about money. And I know that y'all are a little bit frightened to talk about money. So it's a post-pandemic book. So it's a real Canadian book where we're assuming that, you can't just have a potluck and get together. And the members of Peach Blossom Church have survived the pandemic, which I assume everyone here has, but are worried about their future. And if you want to put in the chat, have you ever had that thought about your church? You're like, okay, we made it this far, how much longer? I'd love to know that. So they take a leap of faith, Peach Blossom does, and they hire Pastor Kim to lead them with a stewardship focus, which is unusual, I know, but they do this and it's wonderful for them, not because they're desperate, but because they want to embrace the spiritual discipline of giving. It's a discipleship thing for them. So they start off by meeting in a coffee shop, just a couple of people, and I'll introduce some of those characters in a bit. And they start talking about their giving. Yes, it's possible. I know it is. We can do this. And they learn that giving is a spiritual discipline like prayer. And that's something I'm going to talk about again too, because that is fundamental for thinking about generosity. It's part of our faith. It's not just something that we do to fundraise for our faith. It's part of our faith. So Growing a Generous Church is filled with Bible stories, both from the Old Testament and the New Testament. It's full of stories of how people learn to give. Most of them are real stories that people shared with me, either in a church basement somewhere when I was a consultant, or with permission from my Doctor of Ministry research. I transcribed every word that people shared with me. So I have a lot of stories, many, many stories. So if you're looking for an accessible way to talk about money in your church, and I really do hope this book is accessible. That's what people have told me. It's full of pictures. It's full of stories. There's some jokes. You can tell me whether they're good or not, but there's jokes in there. And I hope that people will enjoy it. And my motto is, Jesus talks about money, your church can too. So I imagine some of you, just from where you've said you're from, might have a small congregation. I don't imagine that. I didn't see St. Andrew's megachurch sign in, but if you did, you're welcome. You're welcome to be here. But I'm imagining that some of the congregations here are on the smaller side. And there's no reason that this talking about generosity isn't limited by the size of your church. But just to let you know that Peach Blossom isn't like an extraordinarily large church. It's a typical small congregation. And they're worried in the beginning of the book, will they be around in a couple of years? Peach Blossom belongs to the National Orchard Church. I just made up a denomination because I thought it would be more inclusive. I talked to all kinds of folks, and I know there's multiple denominations here. So they belong to the National Orchard Church and Appleseed Church. Their sister congregation, not so far away, is closed. And they're a little bit worried that they're next, or that they could be next. And if any of you are thinking that and saying, oh, that could be my congregation, it'd be wonderful to type it in the chat. And if you don't want to, that's cool. But it would be really interesting to know where everyone's at. And so Peach Blossom calls a new minister. Pastor Jerry is retiring, and they call a new minister with a goal of helping them grow in generosity and giving. And that's Pastor Kim. And as I've said, and I'll say again, this is about discipleship. It's not about desperation. It's not about trying to wring the maximum amount of money out of people. It's about joyful generosity. So it's a real story. When I say it's a year in the life, it really is. You'll see that we go through month by month. There's different pictures for every month. And it's designed to be really easy to read and easy to follow. I've written enough academic theses in my life. I wanted something that people could actually read and enjoy reading. So some of the characters that you'll meet in the book, as I've said, are Pastor Kim, who's a new minister. This is her first church. She used to work in a bank. And Pastor Kim feels like a close personal friend at this point. And Pastor Jerry is preceded her. He retired, but he planted some important seeds at Peach Blossom. And some of the things he does, remembering, putting a reminder in the bulletin to remember the church in your will, things that your congregation can easily do. So it's copying Peach Blossom or modifying what Peach Blossom does is totally encouraged. Peggy is the admin assistant. I like Peggy very much. She reminds Pastor Kim of the friendly little word, 2-letter word no, that is so helpful. And Peggy is quite wise too in many ways. And I have a lot of respect for clergy, and I think admin assistants and secretaries are doing the Lord's work every bit as much. And so I have a lot of respect for them as well. We'll meet Eunice and Lee when we talk about the Breakfast Club. Eunice is a retired school teacher. I think you probably have retired school teachers in your congregation. I know I do. Lee is a millennial. He's much younger. He's a little bit older than my kids. And when my daughter and son-in-law read the book, they said that I had appropriated some of their words, but I wanted there to be a mix of people in the book. So Lee is a millennial. And I found in my research that there are 30-year-olds who are interested in giving, and we need to hear their voices too. They form a stewardship team at Peach Blossom. So you're going to hear the stewardship team discussions. They have a church, I call it church council. Presbyterians would call it a session, but there's leadership conversations going on. And they're wondering, well, should the pastor know how much people give? Like it's not just everything happens. They have questions. They wonder about things. They have discussions at Peach Blossom, just like we all do. Diego is someone who might be the youth minister, and Diego's got some questions of his own. So there's a real wide range of characters in the book. A lot of them, like I said, are based on people that I've met. So if there's something in the book that you think, oh, this is too ridiculous, no one would ever say my parents raised me to be an atheist, then that's for sure true. Like that's for sure verbatim. If there's something in there that's a little bit boring, I probably made it up. But all the stuff that sounds too amazing to be true is definitely from someone that I met. So are there any questions already? I can get quite wound up, so I want to make sure to allow room for questions. Okay, so this is the illustration for June. The book goes from June to June, and June is when Pastor Kim starts at Peach Blossom. This is her family picture back there, and the jar of jam that she gets as a thank you, as a welcome gift, and a thank you note. And gratitude is a huge component of the book. It's so foundational to generosity. God gives us everything, and we respond in gratitude to a generous God. That's so, that's just really important to the book. And there's going to be so many ways that they say thank you, so many things to be grateful for, and not just when things are going super good, not just our mountaintop gratitude, but our valley gratitude as well. Because I'm convinced that every church has something to be grateful for. And so I hope that in reading this book and you say, oh, well, how can Peach Blossom be grateful right now? Because that was really a tough thing. There's always something to be grateful for. So I talked about Eunice and Lee a few moments ago. In July is the start of the Big Hearts Breakfast Club. And there's 3 things that a church can always be grateful for, even in hard times. The Peach Blossom is 2 churches that merged, and they had a really rocky point. And one of their foundational things is remembering, that God is still good to us, and we always have God, hope, and we can always worship together, and that we can be grateful, not for all circumstances, but in all circumstances. So when Pastor Kim starts the Big Hearts Breakfast Club, only one person signs up. That's Eunice, the retired teacher. And Eunice doesn't want to talk about money, but she prays. And God kind of gives her a nudge and says, yeah, you got to go. And because she's a retired teacher, she shoulder taps and she says, Lee, you would be a great student. So Eunice, Lee, and Pastor Kim start the Breakfast Club. And over time, different people join at different times. And actually people that aren't even attending the church, but are in the coffee shop listening, join into the conversation as well. So it was fun for me having so many different voices engage with stewardship. And again, these are people that I've met for the most part, voices that I've heard, and I hope they'll be familiar to you. This is meant to be a book that's easy to read, not just visually with the pictures and the illustrations, but with discussion questions as well. You can see the peach blossoms, it's a theme in the book. So every month has different questions, and that's to make it easy for a church group to read through the book and to talk about peach blossom. But my goal here is really to get the church to talk, your church, St. Andrews or Knox Presbyterian or St. John's or whatever your church is, for your church to talk about itself. And I think peach blossom makes a good jumping off point. Like you can talk, once you hear peach blossom story, you can say, oh, well, our church story is this. And in our church, I'm grateful for this. Well, that's a wonderful conversation to have. It's not so much the point to talk about peach blossom, but to talk about your own church and to tell your own story. Like what your church is grateful for. What is your congregation's money story? And I think hearing one story invites others. And that's why I chose this format of a book of real people talking and a real church, they're real, even though they're imaginary. It's one church and what they do. So there's the coffee shop stories going on, and there's what the church does each month too. Like how they change, how they do the offering. Their pre-authorized giving, for instance, is one of my favorite ones as well. If you've seen my webinars before, bless your heart. This is the Circle of Grace giving model, and it's something that I developed in my research, in my Doctor of Ministry research. It's based on 2 Corinthians 8 and 9 and the work of James Dunn, full disclosure. And it's a simple model, and it's in the book a lot. By a few chapters in, the people that in the Big Hearts Breakfast Club can sketch this out on a napkin in a coffee shop, which I've literally done too. So let's just orient ourselves here. Every good thing comes from God. You can all shout amen. I know you're on mute, but every good thing comes from God. That is God at the top of the model and the center of everything. So grace, love, peace, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. All this grace and goodness flows from God to us. And that's why gratitude is so important, because that's where we acknowledge all of that. And as people, we have the opportunity to share and with gracious action to other people. So we're givers and we're receivers in this model. We're at the same time. And as we rejoice in the gift of a lovely day, of the opportunity to sit by the lake, of the kindness of others, of being able to worship even now, we respond with praise and thanksgiving to God. So this is the basis for giving. And a lot of Bible stories I've used in the book using this model, and they literally have drawn out, this is the story of Zacchaeus using this model and so forth. And it's so important to keep God as why we give. If we just have people giving to budget, not even people giving to other people, but people giving to budget, and we don't acknowledge God's goodness to us, then we've just missed this, with this huge theological gap. So it's really important to make our giving in response to a generous God and not about a budget thing. It's a God thing. I could probably talk about that all day, but that's just to say that that's the kind of teaching that's in this book. It's really wanting us to focus on God and God's goodness to us and how we respond to that. So September is a big month in Peach Blossom. I think in most churches, it really is a big month. It's when we kind of get back into corporate worship in a big intentional way. So Pastor Kim in September preaches on left hand, right hand. And she preaches on that because I have heard people talk to me about that so many times, that somehow the Bible tells us we're not supposed to talk about money, which is odd given how many times Jesus talks about money. So Pastor Kim preaches a sermon on the left hand, right hand. You're welcome to borrow what Pastor Kim says. And she also takes questions when someone phones her up and says, nah, they have a little discussion, because money is a tender topic. And I hope that churches will be able to learn from Peach Blossom and say, oh, well, I never thought about that. Oh, yeah.
What does she say about left hand, right hand giving?
Well, she talks about it's not if you give to the poor, it's when. So left hand, right hand. Pastor Kim is fortunately going back to St. Augustine of Hippo on this one. Wonder where she got that from. That it's, first of all, it's about a very specific kind of giving. It's not if you give to the poor, but when. You're not supposed to sound trumpets. And I don't know, I haven't been to every Presbyterian church, but if there is a Presbyterian church that has trumpets during the offering, I'd love to. I haven't encountered churches, whether Presbyterian or otherwise, where people just make, oh, I just gave to the food bank. Woohoo! I am such a fabulous human. I haven't seen it. I don't think we're at risk of being too boastful about our giving. I think what we are at risk of is not pretending to give when we don't, or neglecting testimony and neglecting. One of the things that happens in September is that Mrs. Alton, who is a senior member of the congregation, who's been faithfully giving to Peach Blossom for a long time. Pastor Kim interviews Mrs. Alton before the offering, before the sermon, in fact, and asks her why she gives. And she talks about how God has been faithful to her whole life, and how every time she puts her offering in the basket, she prays for Peach Blossom. She's so grateful for the church. It's been with that support that she received when her husband died. And she is just so grateful for God's goodness in her life and for the church. And that's why she gives to the church. And that's if the only outcome from a church reading this book was that they had a conversation like that, it would be more than enough. Because the best stewardship, as wonderful as all the stewardship staff are here, and you're wonderful, the best stewardship sermon is the testimony of someone in the congregation saying, this is God's faithfulness in my life. I'm so grateful that I can give. So I think that gratitude is testimony. And when we kind of use left hand, right hand to say we wouldn't want to hear about why Mrs. Alton testified of God's goodness in her life, it just breaks my heart. At the Big Hearts Breakfast Club in September, they talk about it's all God's stuff. And again, that's going back to the circle of grace model, and how sometimes if we think it's our money, we hold on a little bit tight, but it's not, it's God's. So that was a whole lot of verbiage from Lori. Is there any questions about that?
I just want to say there was a comment in the chat about how those of us who've had the honor of visiting Presbyterian churches in Malawi have seen them giving the offering, where they get up singing and dancing and going down, which I think is a little different than what you mean. You can be joyful giving the offering and participate in that. It's where you're drawing attention to yourself and saying that I'm so good because I have given this.
Oh,
and
yes.
Trying to take that type of credit for that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So.
Oh, yeah. I have had similar experiences, and yeah, it makes us realize some of our theology is actually culture, or sometimes what we pretend to be theology is actually culture, and we have to, it's those discussions too with our brothers and sisters in other countries that can really help us unpack, what's our theology here, and what's with just like maybe a tradition or a culture, but not really a core gospel thing. Yeah, for sure. And I think privacy about money is one of those things that's maybe a culture or tradition, but it's not a core gospel belief at all.
Keep going. Great.
Okay. I keep saying that every character is my favorite, but I really like Keith. And I wanted to read you a little bit about Keith. I can picture the gentleman that I've met who inspired this character. Keith, the theologian. It's all God's stuff. Keith isn't actually a theologian, but I think he is. It was a beautiful late September day. Keith arrived in a coffee shop before any of the other Big Hearts Breakfast Club people got there. And yes, I did grow up in the 80s. His office manager was holding the fort at the auto supply shop that morning. Keith held a large travel mug that looked like it had been through a war. He had received it as a Father's Day gift when his kids were little and used it ever since. His shirt pocket held reading glasses and a small Bible. Can you picture Keith? Keith thanked Pastor Kim for the invitation when everyone had arrived. I like the children's offering, he said. And interviewing Mrs. Alton, that will stay with me. Glad you were trying new things. Glad to be here. Keith wasn't a talker generally, but when he had something to say, people often found it was worth hearing. I'm glad you came, said Eunice. Welcome. Eunice is the retired teacher. You've had a busy month already, Lee told Pastor Kim. New offering, big sermon, which was great. Pastor Kim smiled. She needed to hear that. Back to school, back to council, Pastor Kim continued. And I've been looking forward to our Big Hearts Breakfast Club. When Pastor Kim asked Keith how he had learned to give, Keith talked about God's ownership of resources. If you're just pleasing yourself, it's a lot harder to give because it feels like it's your money. But if you approach it as it's God's money, not your own, it's a whole lot easier. It was never mine to begin with. Keith turned his coffee cup over in his hands. It's not your stuff, it's God's stuff. Once you make that leap, it changes everything. God made everything. Everything belongs to God, replied Pastor Kim. The Bible tells us this story over and over. In the beginning, God created the world and everything in it, land and sea, animals and plants, people, and the creation which sustains us. But we make the story about me. I worked hard for this money. Why would I give it away? Keith said. If it's all your stuff, you're not grateful in the same way. That's a high bar, said Lee. We really don't own anything. We manage what God gives us. If it's not our stuff, then it's not all about us either, said Pastor Kim. That's part of the redemptive power of giving. It makes you think about someone other than yourself and your needs. The redemptive power of giving, said Lee. You've got the seeds of another sermon there. Pastor Kim scribbled a note to herself and then picked up her coffee. It takes practice to learn how to give, Keith said. It's tough to write a check. Looking at the bank balance, yikes. It's not a natural reaction to give, and it doesn't come easily all the time. How do you know how much to give? Asked Lee. And I'll end it there, although they really do have an interesting conversation about giving. So I wanted to give you a taste of what the book's like. The word soteriology does not come up Ecclesiology doesn't come up as a word, as a concept, lots of times, but as a word, not at all. I really want it to be something that the people who shared their stories with me could read and hear their own story reflected. That's the goal. So here's some of the other topics that are addressed in the book. In October, they talk about tithing and proportional giving of all kinds. And I think that's something important because we often assume we know what the Bible says about that. And in fact, the Bible's full of interesting things. In February, they talk about who can afford to give, because sometimes we assume that people can't give. And that some people live into that assumption, especially younger people. And so I'm so glad to see that the Presbyterians and others embracing digital giving, because if giving is something that's only checks, then we kind of send a message that only people with checkbooks, and that's older folks, that's giving is only for them. So they talk about debt and demographics, and based all on Canadian data about giving. In March, they talk about dying well and bequests. How many people here are mortal? Like almost everybody, that we are all going to die someday. And as Christians, with this wonderful belief in the resurrection and eternal life, surely we can talk about death. I know you're saying, oh, talk about money and death. Yes, we can do this. We are resurrection people. So the book talks about bequests and how to have a bequest policy at your church, based on the story of Peach Blossom receiving a bequest. I hope it's not too much of a spoiler to say that Mrs. Alton leaves the church a bequest, and they have a big bequest celebration event to honor her legacy and to say what they're going to do with the gift. And again, that's based on a true experience that I've had. And if a testimony is a great, the best stewardship sermon, then celebrating a bequest is also the best way that I can imagine to encourage more people to leave bequests. In April, they talk about the church budget and the AGM. And I'm grateful. I know it was at a Presbyterian webinar where someone told me that AGM was Amazing Grace moments. So I'm grateful for that. I don't know what time it is, but I think I might skip over Diego and come back to him if we have more time, because I want to make sure there's room for questions. One of the things about the book is that copying Peach Blossom, that's what you can do. They won't be upset. They're not actually a real church, as real as they are to me, but you can, there's offering prayers in there. You can adopt them for your own congregation. When you hear the story of how Mrs. Alton learned to give, you might say, oh, but this is my story. Excellent. That every church has stories, and I hope that hearing Peach Blossom's story will inspire you to share your own. Other ways that you could copy Peach Blossom are in some of the things that the stewardship team does. Audrey is 78 years old, and she learns how to use Zoom. Bless her heart. And Audrey is also a force of nature. She used to sell a lot of Girl Guide cookies when she was younger, and she adapts some of her same enthusiasm to get people from Peach Blossom to sign up for pre-authorized giving. And so I'm quite impressed with Audrey. She really, she can do new things, and it's not a young person who gets everyone signed up for pre-authorized giving at Peach Blossom. It's someone in their 70s. Are there any questions?
If anyone wants to just unmute and jump in, you could go ahead and try.
Lori?
Yes.
Is your book suitable for life group study, or is it aimed more at the stewardship team?
It's aimed at your general 78-year-old Audrey who just learned Zoom last year. It's meant to be accessible for everybody. Yep.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, you don't have to have any previous if you do have someone who has an extensive theological background, I would, yeah, that would, it's still going to work, but it is meant to be really accessible.
It's
Thank you.
Patrick here. Question. Like it's over a year where the book unravels, let's say, or the story unfolds. Was it designed to be like, i.e., J.K. Rowling's type thing to grow along with the congregation, to be rolled out in one sense to be discussed over the full year, or is it something to do over a month or two, or how did you envision that?
I wanted there to be a good framework to hang it on, because it's easier for us to store concepts when there's like something familiar, and we're all familiar with a calendar. Yep. So that framework was just to make it easier, and then it gives a certain seasonality to the book. In February is my favorite illustration. It's someone using a snow blower and thanking God that because they keep the snow clear in February, no one has fallen and broken a hip in the church parking lot. So I want there to be those real kind of things in the book to make it accessible to people. So that was really my reason for doing it. It doesn't mean that you can only read it one chapter, like that you have to read September and September. No, you don't. You can, the chapters are pretty short. You can get through it faster than a month by month.
Yeah, no, it was more of a thought around movement of, because movement of behavior is in a sense what's happening here, because we're at one level. It's kind of like if everyone's a generous giver, then there's no reason for the book. So there's now not everybody's a generous giver, therefore it's a reason to engage in a study. But it's more of engaging in a change of behavior, change of attitude, and those things, of course, take time. So there's an element of for anything that's going to be a major shift or a major change, it's going to go kind of like more like this than like this, I expect. And therefore, that's in one sense where the question came out of. But my own question then went to, do you use the book over the span of a 12-month span? Do you again, allow the congregation to, here it is, and you'll be just as well to read it because you're going to hear about it every month. It's going to be, we'll touch on this through one of the reflections each month as we go through, Peach Blossom's life within the congregation and how they see money and deal with money. We will do the same thing. It'll be time and point for our reflection. So that was.
Yeah, that would absolutely work. Yeah, you could definitely use the book that way. And I think we actually have at least one person here. I don't want to put them on the spot, but I know there is a diocese that's using the book at a, not month by month, but that have started their study. I mean, the book only came out in April, so I'm pleased that they're looking at it too. I've also had people who say that they've used the book for just their own devotions and they read a little bit of the book every day. So there's not going to be, of course, one size fits all, but the just having a calendar, I think, is just useful for people to say, oh, when, was that, instead of, was that page 78? Oh yeah, it was October because they ate Halloween candy. That's that kind of memory.
Perfect. Thank you.
Doris has a question, and then I've got one from Kathy online that I'll read.
Yeah, I have to put it into the chat. And you said in like one of the early slides, tell the congregation's money story or something like that. And I'm wondering, are you speaking of like the accumulation or a lot of individuals with their money story, or are you speaking of your congregation's sort of history with money or history with giving, or do they have a story to tell about that?
I guess it's a both and. That's a good question, Doris. Specifically what I was referring to is, it turns out, and tell me if this sounds familiar, that Peach Blossom only used to talk about money when they were running short. Anyone here have a congregation like that? And so it's to acknowledge that history, first of all, and say, hey, you know what? We haven't really been talking about this until we send a treasurer up to the front when it's like 2 weeks from year end and we're running behind. And maybe there's another way we could do this. So there's the sort of the corporate money story. but that's how they start. But then they also look at their own story, because I mean, a congregation is a bunch of people, right? And one of the stories in the book, and if you've heard a webinar with me before, I've probably told this one before, but people learning to give, older people learning to give by seeing their dad count up piles of cash at the kitchen table on payday. If you're from that generation, you learned to give when you were 4 years old and you haven't forgotten. But that's not most of us. That's not me. That's not actually the vast majority of people anymore. And so we have to be able to tell those stories. I think it's testimony. I think our gratitude is testimony, but at a more practical level, we can't assume that people learned how to give.
Mhm.
Does that help?
Yeah, I think I sort of thought that there's both stories. There's the story of each individual, which it is important to tell, because that's how, especially as you say, the next generation starts to learn, oh, I can, that's what's expected of me. I think there's some teaching we've been missing for some of the generation coming along. They just don't. I was listening to another webinar on the subject, and says, don't assume that people know where your money is coming from. In other words, there are younger people coming to church who may think that you're getting money from a national church, who think you may be getting money from some sort of government grants. They don't understand that everything that happens there is because people have individually given money for it.
Yeah, and in fairness, there's some older people who don't understand either. But not that
It's a good segue into the question from Kathy, who says, you mentioned earlier millennials are interested in giving. How best to reach them and what appeals to them?
It's the same. It's a story of a cause that we believe in, and this is true really for baby boomers and younger, and we get into that in the book and demographics, like really stories, not the light bill, but what happens when the lights are on. And one day they start telling stories during the offering at Peach Blossom. And one time Larry's in the congregation, and Larry's struggled with homelessness and addiction throughout his course of his life. And Larry comes to the front and says, I'm so grateful that AA meets in the basement. I've been sober for 12 years. Thanks be to God. And that, my friends, is testimony. And it's not because we're paying part of the budget is the light bill. It's that when we contribute to the ministry at Peach Blossom, and part of which happens to be keeping the lights on, we're making space for AA, and we're making space for lives to be changed. So it's like that kind of stories. With actually appeals to I don't think you have to tell special stories for millennials. We're all wired for stories. Does that help?
That's great. We have a comment from Sian. I get annoyed by people who treat church giving like buying a concert ticket. They put money on the plate when they attend a service event only. Very transactional. Yeah,
I get annoyed by that too. That's a really helpful answer, Lori. If you go back to the circle of grace model, we have to rethink. God gives us everything, absolutely everything. There's not our stuff and God's stuff. It's all God's stuff. And so we need to go back, and gratitude helps us with that. Gratitude helps us to remember that what we've been given is from God. And then it's not a transactional thing. And also hearing stories, like Mrs. Alton doesn't approach it like a concert ticket. So the more we're able to talk about it, the more we're able to get those conversations going within our own church. I think that's how we learn and grow. That's how we disciple one another.
It's just to comment on that as well, because our society is transactional right now, and so there's an element of two things I think that we mentioned. One is society is transactional, so hey, what's different between church and any other place in society? And often there are an awful lot of churches that are trying to make themselves reflect society and look like society, so maybe doing more harm than good on that one. But there's that part of transaction. The second thing that was mentioned as well, that people have not been taught to give or why to give, and so that even that the concept around why are we giving and how are we giving? And the concept of how the church operates, all of those things are things that take time. And when people, in one sense, are giving transactionally when they come, or, and at that point in time, and only when they come, there's still, I think, the concept of engaging them in the community, which is more important than the conversation around money. There's an element of money follows mission. And if the relationship is established first, then people will ask why or how, and it'll be inquisitive, sometimes without words. And, there's opportunity there I think for us to speak into as well.
Speak and live. Yeah. It's all connected with discipleship. Money isn't just a means to ministry. It's part of ministry, and ministry is big. Yeah. I think the person from is there more questions, Karen? I shouldn't necessarily.
No, go ahead.
I think St. John's Thorold is here. And if so, thank you so much for posting this picture on Facebook of reading the book. That was really fun to see. When I was pulling this slide together, I just went through my email and pulled out some things that people had told me. Thank you for this great tool. People are really enjoying it. The notion and practice of generosity, not desperation, resonates at this time for me. It was so great to start my day, each day, with a bit from this book. And this Facebook post is from Calgary, actually. Growing a Generous Church is a great book, must read, easy story read with tons of amazing gems. So it's really encouraging for me, because it took ages and ages to write a book, to see that the book is actually getting out there in the world. It's been fun. If you'd like to get my book, I'm Dave's record store of books, I think. I may not be big, but I'm small. You can order a book from my website, which is lgreesor.com, or a Common Word bookstore in Winnipeg, depending on where you are. That might be a way that you could just pick it up. It is $24 for a single copy, and it's $30.95. I'm quite sure of this figure for one single copy mailed anywhere in Canada. If you live in Mississauga, and we could do a front porch thing, or if you're nearby, I'm pretty flexible. I really would love for there to be book clubs, because I think that when we can talk about money together, that's community. I mean, a Mennonite, so community is huge for me, but as the body of Christ, we are believers in community. So there's a discount. It's $2 off if you buy 10 books, $2 off a copy if you buy 10 books. And through my testing so far, if you're in Ontario or Manitoba, 10 books is under $20 postage. So it's about $250 for 10 books in Central Canada, which is really a good deal. And I know Presbyterians like a good deal. I just found a coupon from Canada Post, and they have this thing called flat rate shipping boxes. So there's a way to get 5 kilos of books for $20 for the coupon, or 5 kilos of books for $26, and that goes anywhere. So that's quite good. You can get 14 books for in that box. Okay, and that's how you can get a hold of me. That's my website. Is there other questions, or you want to jump in, Karen?
Yeah, I'll just see if there's any other. This has been great. And I know we have actually a whole list of questions that we could talk all day about, because there's so much good material in this book. It really does cover most of the issues that we look at and talk about as stewardship. So it's a great way to introduce your congregation. I'll get you to say one thing. I think this was interesting, that it's great you use Canadian statistics in the book, and you have the one that says as much as 40% of Canadian church attenders do not donate to their church. And where did that come from? And what do you think, what did you discover when you learned that?
I've presented that figure a lot of places, and you know who is never surprised by that figure? Church treasurers. So again, there's not a central database of Christian giving in Canada. I wish that there was, but everything I've seen from multiple denominations and across congregations confirms that figure. And people will say, well, oh, but those people are on the list, but we don't expect them to give. Cool, that strategy is working excellent. They're not giving. I mean, what do you say? But again, I think the left hand, right hand, and the privacy around giving, it's not hiding trumpets, it's hiding people that don't give. And I think people don't know. We haven't taught them, we haven't encouraged them. This is going to sound really ranty, but it's an opportunity, it's a discipleship opportunity that we've been neglecting. That's what it is.
I see Catherine Morgan has raised her hand, so you can have a comment, and then I'm just going to highlight a couple of PCC resources that you could use to complement Lori's book. Go ahead, Catherine.
We're actually the diocese that is doing this as a diocesan-wide book study with a brand new stewardship network. And so each church has contributed 2 or 3 people who are all reading this book. And there's kind of discussion groups of anywhere from 15 to 20 on Zoom calls once a month to talk about some of this stuff. And so it's been a fabulous tool, partly because it doesn't assume it's an easy entry point for everybody. So some of these people have been on stewardship committees for a long time. Some folks are new to this, and it's been a really kind of great tool and an easy thing for people to engage with and to talk with. And so it's been a great resource, and you're welcome for the picture from my front porch. But as I said, it's been an easy one. In fact, I gave this to my dad in his church. He is not a reader, and he is loving the book because it's simple little stories. It's bite-sized pieces of information, and it's not a 5-point plan and a project at the end kind of thing. It's about changing attitudes and changing thinking and changing how we respond and how we talk about stewardship. So it's been exciting. In fact, our big Dawson conversation is tomorrow. There's 3 different Zoom calls tomorrow about the next chunk of the book. But as I said, it's been a great tool. It's lovely to have a Canadian author who does this as well. We're not using American examples or stats as well. And so that's been a lovely gift as well. So I'm sorry to interrupt and to thank you for letting an Anglican come and hang out, but it's been a fantastic resource. And as I said, really easily accessible for anybody who wants to know more. And it's not overwhelmed or kind of intimidated people. They feel very comfortable reading the book. Most of them are reading it in like one big chunk and then going back and reading each month again. But folks have found it really accessible and a lovely entryway into conversations about stewardship for people who maybe aren't as comfortable or aren't as it's not as easy for them to do that. So
Great, thank you. There's the power of testimony already, if you ever need to hear that. So all right, I'm gonna do like a really quick highlight of a few resources that you could find that would augment from the Presbyterian Church in Canada that would complement some of the themes that are in Growing a Generous Church. And then I'm gonna leave it open for questions from Lori. I don't want to take people past the hour time, but we have time and we can stay on for conversation if people are interested in doing that. So I'll just do this, do a quick highlight. If people are looking for stewardship resources at the Presbyterian Church in Canada, they can go to, okay, let's see if this will work. Uh-oh. When I used the test, oh, there we go. Can people see my website? Oh, clicked a few times. Okay, some thumbs up. So at presbyterian.ca/stewardship, you will find a nice stewardship section that is just jam-packed with stewardship material. In fact, there's so much stewardship material there. We know that there's too much there and we need to go through and weed and cull. But if you're looking, just sort of feel free to sort of browse around and see what you can discuss. So there's 4 different tabs. There's a culture of generosity and all types of resources that can help you build a culture of generosity in your congregation, and introduction of staff are. There's resources to help you talk about money, and you'll find resources there. Digital giving, pre-authorized giving, bequests and other legacies, you can find information there. There's a bunch of downloadable PDFs that you can find and you can use there. And here we've got some nice webinars. And this Jesus Talks About Money, We Can Too, is a webinar by Lori Guenther Reesor, where we talk about money. There's also a section on caring for creation with resources there. Oh. And then there's also growing steward leaders, so different opportunities for steward leaders. In each of these sections, there's these side drop-down bars, so you'll find things about plan gifts and what's a tithe, tools for congregations, stewardship inserts, setting up a bequest fund. That's a great resource that was developed by Herb Gale on how to set up a bequest and an endowment fund, or a bequest and or endowment or legacy fund that's been based on some of our learnings. So just wanted to let you know that feel free to dig around the website. And if you're in doubt or looking for things, then ask the stewardship staff and we'll help you find things that are there. Okay, see if I can go back to the PowerPoint. Here we go. When you dig around the thing, one thing that you'll find is narrative budget and information on narrative budget. We've just produced a new 4-page brochure, how you could do a narrative budget and show it to your congregation. This is what Lori talks about when she says, share your congregation story and share the stories that are changing people's lives. This narrative budget teaches and gives you the tools for your session, for example, to talk about what the church is doing other than paying the light bills and the minister's salary and insurance and health and benefits and all of that, but what the impact that you're having when you give to the church. So it transforms your line item budget into one that says, this is how we're reaching out to people. This is how we help people connect. This is how we worship together. This is how much we put into caring. So that helps do that. There are resources, including sample thank you letters and a webinar on saying thank you, and how to express that gratitude that Lori says forms such a foundation of stewardship. If you're looking at to tithe or not to tithe and want to have some discussion on tithing, you'll find some information there. I'd suggest you, when you read the book, that Lori has the chapter about tithing. You can see we have a bulletin insert, a giving guide, which talks about how the Bible teaches to give. So give gratefully, give cheerfully, give freely, and give intentionally and proportionally. So it does look at that and say, okay, well, where do you want to start? Do you want to start at 2%, 4%, 5%, 15%, 20%? And on the back, it helps people, if they decide to give intentionally and proportionately, how much they could give. There's a great thing in Lori's book where she looks at teaching to give. People think, oh, I'll just wait and learn more about giving when I've got money. And Lori, you look at it and you're like, no, we can learn to give now. And if you look at proportional giving, you can give at every level. There's resources on digital giving. If people are like, how can I put that button on my website? How can we easily get people to go through? And if you're confused by that at all or scared by it at all, again, talk to Jim McDonald. He knows inside and out Canada Helps and Tidely and a few other web solutions, and he will walk your congregation through, and he will work with your webmaster and your treasurer to set that up if you haven't yet tried digital giving. So, but I know most of you have. We've had so many people transition this past year. There's nothing like a pandemic to suddenly get churches all about digital giving. Not when it was like, oh, let's reach the millennials so they can give, but oh, let's make sure that we can all give. Gifts of securities, you'll find information about planned gifts, including gifts of securities. We're finding this is increasing in popularity. And if you're thinking, oh, my congregation could never get a gift of securities because they have to give it as a gift in kind, I'll just say the Presbyterian Church in Canada will receive gifts of securities for any Presbyterian congregation or ministry or any national program as a gift of security. You just have to designate where you want it to go. We will send the funds on to congregations with no administration fee. There's just some broker fees, and if there's the change in value, but all the proceeds of the gift would go, and a person will get they get a tax receipt for the full market value of the gift of securities, and they do not have to pay capital gains tax. As soon as you start saying that, people get very excited about gifts of securities. But again, people give because they see what the difference is going to make. This just can sometimes help make it easier to give. You can order and see legacy giving inserts on different ways that people may give, from charitable gift annuities to making a bequest to giving the gifts of life insurance. This is for people who are like, I really want to support the church. Help me find the best way to do it with the resources I have. All right, and there's our planned giving staff contact information and numbers again, which you can also find online. So there's my little plug for doing the Presbyterian thing. I want to thank everyone for coming. We're very grateful. We want to continue to open up and have more webinars in the fall and conversations and make them relevant and important to you. So if you want to type in the chat, or you can also share with us what topics you'd like to do or talk about. Maybe something today has sparked your interest and you say, oh, I'd like to just hear about this, and I'd really like to just talk and go in depth. If you're interested in us facilitating any stewardship discussions in your region, talk to us, and we'd be happy to do that. If there's a group who want to start a book club and we could help promote that, we will. We've learned with Zoom that you can do things across the country. So there's my thing, and I'll see. Yeah. It takes us right till 3 o'clock, right on the dot. So it's sort of our formal webinar is over, but we're welcome and happy to continue to have conversation with anyone who wants to continue to converse for a little while.
Yeah.
Can I mention a couple of things here?
Sure.
The narrative budget, we did that 2 years ago, where we called it a pie, and then we subdivided the pie and presented that at our AGM. And it made a tremendous difference. The congregation understood better what it was all about. When they saw it in print, like it doesn't register as much, but seeing it there visually on the board, just about throughout our meeting, people asked very many questions about it, related to it. And they left having a much better understanding of where the money is going and
the impact it's having. They could really see what impact it was having.
They appreciated that much more. And it has resulted in a really serious effort on part of the congregation to do better. And as a matter of fact, last year, we ended with a surplus. And going forward, like up to date, we're a bit behind, but we're in a pretty solid foundation the way the things are now. And the second thing is, I don't know if you heard of Canada Helps.
Yep.
That we use that and it's very, very helpful. Last year, I think we brought in, I think it was about 3,500 from Canada Helps. They take a percentage of it, but all the same. It was like found money to us because that came from there. Some of it might have been our congregation because of the pandemic. We had no way of tracking that. But at the same time, this year, we are still getting an upsurge in donations through Canada Help.
Great.
So for what it's worth, thank you.
Yeah, I have a great illustration. Just last month, we had somebody who wanted to give through the PCC website to a congregation because they had attended there years and years ago, and they still wanted to support their ministry. And we said, oh, we can't do that. It's too much through our website. And they were like, oh, the congregation doesn't have a donate button on their website. And they wanted to give monthly to support the thing. So I suggested to them that they go to Canada Helps and they could do it through Canada Helps. And so they did. And the congregation was at first like, oh, we're taking e-transfers. They could just e-transfer us, but sort of realizing, oh, wait a minute, this is someone not coming to the congregation from the outside who wants to support the ministry. They might not be comfortable with an e-transfer. You can't set up e-transfers for monthly and all of that. So they were just suddenly like, oh, yeah, it was a little light bulb went on for giving in that instance.
Yeah, it does work.
Okay, I've got Ron.
Yeah, Karen, we're about to start renting to a brand new congregation. Well, this will bring in extra cash, and I'm wondering through Lori, how we might convince our congregation that that's not an excuse to back off on their givings.
That's an interesting one. The way you've said back off is a bit, It's the telling the stories of what God is doing through your congregation and what wonderful things is doing. And if you had if someone gave, there's a story of what your budget will do. If someone gave 100,000 extra, what wonderful things might God be up to if you could get if people contribute above budget. So it's the story and the vision and the ministry of the vision for ministry that you have, and telling that story every single Sunday. I also have a side hustle working for hospitals and hospital foundations from time to time. And they would drool at the opportunity that we have as Christians to tell stories every single week, live and in person. And so I tell stories, say thank you, pay attention. There's 6 words of advice.
And
Thank
if
you.
people think that they're giving just to give to pay a church budget, then it makes sense, I can reduce. But when you're giving in response to God's generosity, and you're giving because it's part of discipleship and it's part of who we are as Christians, then it's like, oh, that you celebrate that there's more resources that the church has to do more of its ministry. And so I think that's where, if you're sharing the story, oh, our church is paying lighting bill and salary and heating and all of that, then people will, oh, once that's paid off, there's nothing. But when you're saying, no, our church is reaching out to the poor, caring for the poor, we're sharing the good news to people who've never heard it, then you can say, oh, well, that mandate is endless. We can just do more.
Right.
Great question.
Mm-hmm.
And such a real scenario.
Very much so. The rental thing is huge. And we have to, I know that there's some authors and people doing some really good work about stewardship of buildings, and it's all connected. It's all connected.
We lost about 15,000 last year from rentals.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, this is Jim McDonald, the development manager, just chipping in about Canada Helps and Tidely. Especially though, in terms of Canada Helps, I just wanted to say, Roy, you were talking about the difficulty of knowing who gave. And I just wanted to let folks know that you actually can know who gave if you actually acquire the account, if you basically capture the account, and also you get a discount on the fees. So you can actually go on the website and see who gave. And you don't give them a receipt, you just give them a thank you card, but it's nice to know who gave, right? So
Yeah.
that's one of the things I recommend to folks who sign up for Canada Helps. Yes, it's a foundation, so they give the receipt. Your church doesn't give the receipt, but it doesn't mean the church can't go on and see who gave. Unless they've marked it as anonymous, your church can find out who gave.
And most people don't mark it as anonymous.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I want to thank once again Lori for joining us and giving us some tidbits to think as we head into summer and start thinking about the fall and begin doing plans for it. It's always a joy to talk to you about stewardship. You've got such a wealth and depth of knowledge.
Well,
and
thank you.
Thank you for taking time to share it with us. So yeah, thanks everyone for coming and joining us.